Hello, welcome to my channel, Back to the Love. My name is Ina, and this is Growing Up with My Grandchildren, Part 3. In Part 1 and 2, I briefly introduced myself and said why I came up with the euphemism, growing up with my grandchildren, meaning that at my big old age, I'm still learning things. We all learn at different paces, different times, and sometimes we don't get it when we probably should have gotten it, but we get it. And that's why I say growing up with my grandchildren, because every day I'm learning something new, as we all do. In Part 1, I briefly introduced myself, talked about some of my children and the experience that I had being a young mom, and some of the insecurities that came with that, not wanting to have, my daughters become teen moms, and I put my own insecurities in them because I was trying to protect them, but sometimes we have the best intentions, but things can still go sideways. My daughters never became teen moms. They, have not went and did crazy things that I once was into, and I'm happy that they had sense enough to make some sound decisions. And I didn't give them enough credit that they were capable of doing that because, again, it was my own insecurities. Anyway, I didn't speak about my sons at the time. And my youngest son, he had some unique experiences that the other kids didn't have, at least what he shared with me. I did my best to shelter them from the mean streets of Detroit. And no matter how hard we try, life happens. Like I said in Part 2, reality showed up. For example, one day my youngest son, he was taking a bus back from high school. He was in the 11th grade. And, with gang activities in the city, you would run into guys that just try you and see what you're made out of. And if you got the stuff that they're looking for to be in their game, they would jump you in sometimes. And I think that was one of the situations that he found himself in, because waiting on the bus, a bunch of kids approached my son when he was waiting, and they jumped him. A Good Samaritan was on her way to McDonald's. She said, she stopped and saw these boys were jumping my son. But before she stopped, she went on to McDonald's, got her order, came back and saw they still were fighting. I don't know why the lady didn't stop the first time, but the second time she saw them, she stopped. My son said she told him that she got out of her car and said she just took a picture of them, the guys that was fighting my son, and that she had called the police. She offered my son a ride to take him somewhere safely. So he had her take him to the next bus because he was going to transfer to another bus to come home. That was really, traumatic for him because although he was, he's always been a big guy. At that time, he probably was a solid 6 feet, maybe 180, 190. So he could hold his own. But it was like 5 guys, he said. And the lady even remarked to my son, like, you were hanging with them, but by the time she came back, they had him on the ground and they were beating him. So I'm glad that lady stopped and helped him. And I never got a chance to thank her because he didn't get a number or anything. But I was very appreciative because if it's in Detroit, it could have been a different outcome. That was bad for him. So I was like, no, you're not taking a bus to school anymore. I'm going to drop you off. That lasted for about a month because, he was like, Mom, I'm all right. I'm not worried about those guys. But then a month later, he did transfer to another school and finish school without any incident happening. He went to college. One evening, coming home from school, he's at a bus stop. He had already transferred, but he got off the bus to go to Church's Chicken, he said. And he said this man walked up to him who was clearly drunk and pulled a gun out on him. And he robbed him. My son said he had just got his paycheck, but he hadn't cashed it, and he was happy about that. So he gave the man under $20. So the man asked him, what are you doing out here? What do you do? What is your life like? And my son told him, well, I'm just trying to get by, man. I'm coming home from school, and, I'm just doing what I can do in life to get by. And so the guy decided at that moment that he wanted to tell my son what brought him to that particular point to rob him and where he was in his life to be in a situation like that where he needs to rob someone to get by. My son used common sense. He listened to the man. He didn't say anything that would agitate him. He was, still quite aware that the man had a gun and he had been drinking. You never know what would happen. So after a while, the man decided that my son was, a nice person. And he said, you know what? You're someone I would like to even date my daughter. You are such a nice guy. So everybody can't walk away from a situation or have walked away from a situation when a gun was drawn on them. But my son did, and I'm very happy about that. So although at home I did my best to create a safe haven, the reality is they still were in a large inner city that had a lot of crime, but he survived. I had my youngest daughter. She's in high school. She's in accelerated classes, and a girl group wanted to jump her in. They were known as the Rainbows. And the Rainbow group was like, you come in and you be like us. And, it was an alternative girl group. And it was at a time where there wasn't a lot of conversation about children in school that chose an alternative lifestyle. That's what it was mainly called then. And they wanted to jump my daughter in. But one of the teachers saw what was happening in the hallway, and she came and rescued my daughter. Immediately, my daughter was like, I am not going back to this school. So she transferred to somewhere else, and it turned out to be a good experience for her. She graduated with honors, and I think it was a few other incidents with her, but it wasn't nothing as severe as what my son had experienced. So it could have been worse. I could have been running to the jailhouse trying to bail out children, and that wasn't an experience I had. So I was very thankful for them, and just thankful that some things they learned from me and some things they learned from just their own practical sense, common sense, their contemporaries, educators. And I had to learn that, it's not just your show, Ina. You can't control absolutely everything. And sometimes as parents, we think we like up here, like we are number one on the totem pole. Everybody else, they just have to fall in their own place. But, when they get a certain age, that's true when they're little babies. That's really true. And until they get into their adolescent years, that's very true. And they can be close with us always. But when they're coming into their own understanding, third at best, they have their contemporaries, their friends, influences from every other angle. But it's their own self that's in there. So I had to learn that. And I would grapple with it because I love being mom. I love for them to come to me first and talk to me first. And they do. I told them that they could tell me anything they wanted to tell me. See, that's my cat. And that sometimes, no, I'm sorry. I have two cats. Come here. Come here, Smokey. Come say hi. Come here. Let me introduce you. You'll be good. This is my cat, Smokey. Say hello, Smokey. She heard me talking and had to come in the room. But I wasn't talking to you, Smokey. You'll be good. Go away. Sorry. I didn't show them on camera, but that is Smokey, my shadow. Follows me everywhere. Anyway, I'm starting to grow up. The reason why I say this is the Detroit edition, there's some wonderful things happening in Detroit today. I moved to another state 12 years ago. And before I moved, there was a lot of talk and a lot of work and effort from the city planners to make Detroit into a world-class city. And the initiative was Detroit 2020, when that was supposed to happen. I'm sorry, when that was supposed to happen. But we had some issues that happened that came along and turned the world around, and things were delayed. Even, Detroit wonderful plan. But now, 2025, wonderful things have happened, especially downtown. But before this year, I think around 2021, maybe 22, I'm not quite sure of the date, they brought all the Detroit teams back to play in the city, as they once were for many, many years. But when the city changed and a lot of urban blight and the violence went up, a lot of folks wasn't coming to, see sports in our town. So they built arenas outside of Detroit. But then they built a new arena, Comerica Park, and it housed a lot of sporting events and I guess concerts and things of that nature. So all the teams came back. And of course, around this time, the Lions started getting better. And they almost won. But they did win, even though they did not actually make it all the way to the Super Bowl. They started winning public acceptance. The Lions for a very long time was a long-running joke. They sometimes will have a great team, but just blow it in the end. But they've been doing pretty well, and I'm pretty sure they will be world champions. They will win the Super Bowl. And I like that people are starting to see that now, giving them some credit. But we've always had awesome teams in Detroit, the Pistons, the Bad Boy era. Nobody can touch it. We had the Red Wings, world-class winners, and the Tigers. They've been around forever. And that legendary Old English D, Tom Selleck, I think he hails from Michigan too. He always wore it on his shows. And, so many interesting people have come out of Detroit. And I love to see that they have really changed. It's changing. The whole ideal of Detroit, what people believe Detroit to be. Many years ago, if you're watching late night TV, Detroit came up pretty often, but it wasn't positive. It was always something nasty to say about Detroit in reference to crime and violence. Because at one time, Detroit did have the #1 spot for a very long time. I don't know what ranking it is now, but it's not #1. Perhaps in the top 5. This sounds plausible, but not #1 in violence. And that's really good because it reminds me of my younger years where Detroit was relatively safe. Me and my siblings, when it was hot weather, we could sleep on the porch with a pillow and no one came to bother us kids. We can go out and trick-or-treat without parents and just be kids and play outdoors all day. Of course, from the age that I am, in my generation, we had to be in before the street lights came on. But kids were relatively safe, And I don't know if Detroit will ever be like that again, actually anywhere. Because, you just never know. And although some neighborhoods are safe, nothing is completely safe. Nowhere is. So we always have to be vigilant and, keep our senses about us. But it is good to know that there is some safe areas. In Detroit downtown, right now, seems like that is a situation that they created. There's a place called Riverwalk that I remember. It was kind of a bad area. But now it's Detroit River. That's your whole scene. And on Riverwalk, they added all these venues and park benches, and they, you got the water with Detroit Princess. I think that's the name of this yacht that people, charter for parties and things like that. And that's going by. And then sometimes they have the boat races, and anybody can take out their boat when they want to. And then, what's so great? Right at Riverwalk, Hart Plaza, And, in Belle Isle even, you got all these wonderful things to look at. For example, when you're downtown at the Riverwalk, you look straight across the river, there is Toronto. Whole nother country. Well, there have been talk that it might not be a part of the U.S. pretty soon. Don't know. We will wait to see about that. But it was always nice to see, there are our Canadian neighbors right across the river. Detroit also held right in the middle of the city an island, Belle Isle. I loved going to Belle Isle when I was a kid. But then it changed. Crack came into the scene. It was not the same. Although they still had the zoo, I think a planetarium, of course the beach, and a lot of other wonderful park amenities. But then when the drugs came, and the doughboys that they like to call themselves, it just wasn't a conducive place for you to go with your family. And, it was really different for a while. But I haven't been to Belle Isle in a while. The last time I was in Detroit, I wanted to visit, but I didn't get a chance. But I've been reading good things about Belle Isle. And it had a casino, and it had the yacht club there. I did attend some weddings there and receptions at the Detroit Yacht Club. So there's a lot of great things happening in Belle Isle, which is very near the downtown area. So seeing Detroit from how it was as a youth, in my younger adult years, seeing how it went through an economic downturn, a lot of the, industry, the auto industries just left. And the subsidiary factories that manufacture parts for the larger companies, they shut down. And it was the age where jobs were scarce. And then, a lot of people just left the city. They moved out. It was, at one point, I remember 1.6 million, and then they lost like close to 700 people in that number. It might even be under 1 million now, but I haven't read the statistics in a minute. But I remember a lot of people were moving, primarily down south. The big thing back in the day was move to Atlanta. That's where the jobs were, which was very true. It was a time when I was a youth, when my father still was alive. It wasn't uncommon to hear that people moved from down south up north to get a job at the factory. But then things changed later, and everyone was going back down south to find work. But anyway, Detroit is a good place now. There's still crime. It still is a large city. There's still some areas where it's not ideal to be in. But there are some great things about Detroit, not just downtown. What a lot of people don't realize, because they showed on the news often, the urban blight. I think it's something called ruin pea, sound like corn, that people just enjoy looking at ran down places. Takes all kinds of world. But what a lot of folks don't know, those old oligarchs that was out there with the Fords and all of them, they built some beautiful things in Detroit that include mansions, beautiful neighborhoods. Belle Isle, for one, was a monumental achievement. Downtown, the Detroit Public Library, I still love going there with my children. A wealth of information there. The DIA, Detroit Institute of Arts, of course, Wayne State University. There's a lot of good things about Detroit. So this is growing up with my grandchildren.